Hi everyone, I'm Siobhan Milner and this is Total Performance, a podcast dedicated to all things athletic performance and injury prevention. Join me and my guests as we explore the many aspects that come together to build our total performance picture. Let's get into it. In this episode, I speak with Angela Sorensen about Olympic weightlifting, and we particularly talked about the value of Olympic weightlifting and its derivatives for dancers and other non-traditional athletes. Dr. Angela Sorensen holds a PhD in sports biomechanics from Middlesex University. She's been serving as the head strength and conditioning coach at English National Ballet School since 2018. Previously, Angela has served as the director of sports performance at Loyola University Chicago for 6 years, where she was the strength coach for the back-to-back men's volleyball national champions in 2014 and 2015. She's also worked in private sports performance, co-authored and instructed international coaching education courses, worked in physical therapy, and has presented her research at international conferences. She earned her bachelor's degree in exercise science at the University of Nebraska, Kearney in 2004, her master's degree in sport and exercise science from Middlesex University in 2018, and PhD in 2023. Angela talked a little bit about the fact that weightlifting is often seen as overly complex, yet she believes it can be simplified and made accessible, and she believes that it offers immense benefits in power, strength, and stability. We talked a lot about the benefits of weightlifting for dancers and other non-traditional athletes. We also talked about some of the misconceptions regarding balance training and how there are misconceptions in general around training that are a little skewed by social media trends. And we talked about what she thinks is important for athletes and dancers to focus on in their training. Welcome, Angela. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Siobhan?
I am good. I've had a busy day with athletes, but I'm excited to get to talk to you because it's always great to get to pick the brains of other S&C coaches.
Yeah, it's always nice to connect with like other S&C coaches, see what they have to say. I like stealing a lot of my info and knowledge from other coaches, so hopefully we can have a little exchange.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you started working with athletes?
When I was an athlete, like what feels like eons ago, but was only about, 20 years ago, I was in track and field in university, and I was a pre-med for some reason. I was like, cool, I want to be a doctor, as one does. And I realized after half a semester of organic chemistry, I was like, this isn't my jam. So I actually walked up to my strength coach at the time and I was like, hey, John, how do I do what you do? And he's like, right, you need to do this, this, and this. So I went over, I changed my major immediately. I convinced him to do an internship for me. And then, from there, it just grew and grew. So basically, when I was during my undergrad, I realized that I liked being in the weight room and I liked working with sports. It didn't have to be a specific sport, but I really liked getting myself strong. So I thought it was really cool to actually also be able to get other people strong. And then from there, it's blossomed over the last 20 odd years of, being around a weight room and helping athletes and individuals reach a new potential.
Amazing. And I know you've done a PhD in biomechanics. So I'm curious, how does that fit into the whole strength and conditioning journey? Did you work with athletes for a little while and then go do some of the PhD after?
So I'm what they refer to as a mature student, meaning that I didn't go from my undergraduate into a master's into a PhD. I was lucky enough to do my undergraduate. And then after 2 years, I started working in private sports performance instead of just personal training. I went into private sports performance where I was actually working as like an S&C coach. And then it was there for several years, kind of did a sideways shift into working in physical therapy for about 5 years. Was able to make the transition back to strength and conditioning in private sports performance and kind of served a dual role between physical therapy aide and S&C coach. And then I got a wonderful opportunity to work at Loyola University Chicago as an S&C, as an assistant strength and conditioning coach. Was there for 6 years. Kind of decided like, I want to go back. I want to dig into stuff a little bit deeper. So I quit my very comfortable lifestyle, very comfortable job I loved. Everyone was wonderful there, and decided to move to London to pursue a master's degree. So I already had loads of practical experience, probably more than 15 years of practical experience at that point. moved to London, decided I liked my master's program so much that I might as well just carry on into doing a PhD in biomechanics. And you could kind of say that I've specialized in Olympic style weightlifting over the years because I've competed and coached weightlifters for 20 years. So I did a PhD in the kinetics and kinematics of weightlifting. So I have obviously like a crazy amount of knowledge about like weightlifting, but I think my favorite part about having been a mature student is that now I could take what I knew practically and prove it in research, and now I can take that research back in. And whether I'm working with personal training clients or with CrossFitters or athletes, or I even work with dancers as well, I know how these mechanics, how these, biomechanical principles actually apply in these different settings. And with that practical knowledge, I'm able to utilize different weightlifting derivatives in a very, unique and interesting way in a lot of these settings and make it applicable and accessible to pretty much anybody, really.
You've mentioned these different populations as well. So there's CrossFit, dancers, personal training. I think we all understand, obviously, that those who are going to compete in weightlifting or things like CrossFit, where they have some weightlifting variations in their competitions, we understand why they might do Olympic weightlifting in their training. But for some of the other populations, so personal training clients, dancers, what would you say about how we might or might not incorporate Olympic lifting into their training? Is there value for this? What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so with weightlifting, I know so many coaches have negative views on utilizing Olympic weightlifting derivatives in a performance environment because they say it's too complicated to teach. And so my suggestion is, if it's too complicated to teach, it's because you don't understand it yourself. It's actually super simple to break it down. And all of the research says that, like, hey, like, this is one of the best things to do for power development. So in some of these other populations, like working with dancers, like, while it's atypical for a dancer to lift weights because, oh my God, I'm going to get so big, I'm going to get huge. Like, oh no, like, no, what we're actually doing is we're doing a few things that are very similar and biomechanically speaking, but also, we need them strong, we need them powerful, and then there's alternative things to think about with like load acceptance. So there is a case for utilizing Olympic weightlifting in like a dance setting, because with different styles of dance, you actually have you have the same athletic foundations needed as sport athletes, but these are more like artistic athletes. So you still need to be able to jump high. You still need to have, reactive strength. A lot of times there are partner dances where they need to lift somebody overhead. So we need to know the rhythm and the timing. We need to be able to practice that in a safe environment and sort of a consequence-free environment. So it's very easy. Let's do a push press. All right, we've got a little bit of a counter movement, dip, press. Oh, what's that look like? That looks like lifting a partner overhead. So it's not so much like, oh my God, I'm having them Olympic lifting. I am mimicking some of the mechanical characteristics, some of the rhythm and timing of some of these movements, and they're able to sort of fast track their development when they're working on this. So if we're working on, say, like a push press to work on that dip and the timing and pressing out, they're doing it with a weight. So if they drop the weight, not a big deal. And they get to practice it ahead of time. Then they go in the studios. All right, now we're going to practice it with a partner. A little bit more of a consequence. If they drop their partner, probably not a good thing, right? But in the meantime, we've kind of taught them the foundational movements, the foundational rhythm of how to utilize their own strength and power and stability to actually make what they do in the studio much, much easier. So if you know anything about weightlifting, you can break it down into phases. And within those phases, you can do sub movements. So you don't have to do a full power clean. You can do, a high pull. You can do just a shrug. So you can still get a lot of these physical characteristics in something that's easy to manage for individuals. Now, I know it's not always, weightlifting isn't the answer to everything, although we'd love it to be, so like that's where like the art of coaching comes in, because I know some of my athletes, some of the dancers that I've worked with, some of the CrossFitters, some of like my personal training clients who are interested in it, they might not need a specific, they might not need to snatch from the floor. They might just want to do a little bit of practice from like the hang. So that's where all of my practical experience comes in. Like, all right, I recognize this isn't your thing. So I want you to develop these physical qualities, but we're going to make it in something that you enjoy just a little bit more. Because at the end of the day, as strength and conditioning coaches, we want to make them better, but we want them to have fun. And we also want to make sure that they don't get hurt. So those are just some of the things that I tend to think about when I start applying all of, what I've learned over the years, whether in a practical environment or in a lab-based situation.
This is really interesting because actually, so I spoke in the last series of this podcast, I spoke to a strength coach called Jason Harrison, who works primarily with dancers. And one of the things that he and I were talking about was how sometimes dancers, if we're talking about this population in particular, they look at things like Olympic weightlifting or even just standard strength training and powerlifting derivatives, and they think that it doesn't look like dance, so they don't do it. They kind of, sometimes their what they call cross training ends up looking too much like dance and not enough like strength training or weightlifting. But I think you've just done a really good job of actually explaining why some of these weightlifting derivatives actually do quite well mimic the demands of dance.
Yeah. So like with a lift or with like a partner lift or any of that, rhythm and timing. Well, if you think about, a lot of times, some of the arguments in strength and conditioning in S&C for utilizing like a catch of a power clean is load acceptance, like being able to decelerate, to absorb that force, if you will, although that's a little bit of a physics no, it's not. So being able to accept an external load, and a lot of times we talk about that in context of NFL players or rugby players because they are physically running into somebody. So you need to be able to decelerate not just your weight but an external force. Well, in dancing with partners, depending on the movement, depending on the style of dance, that partner is going to be jumping at you, or you still have to lower them down. You have to understand how to decelerate yourself and an external load, whatever that load is. And in dance, that's the case for being able to like learn a very basic power clean, from the hang, because you learn how to stabilize, to brace. And that's one of those overlooked qualities. And that's why I think weightlifting is so great, is because you develop the power, you develop good range of motion, and you develop a whole lot of dynamic stability, because if you can't brace when you receive that load, it's dangerous. Well, if you're in sport or anything you're using, in life, you have to decelerate sometimes. And sometimes you're holding something, you also need to decelerate, even for like mothers, like if they for somehow trip and fall and they hold the baby, they have to slow down and understand how to decelerate so they don't get injured. And so that's like another component that it makes weightlifting so great, because you can hit all of these physical capacities in one simple lift. So like, I feel like I'm sounding like an infomercial right now, like just weight lift, it solves everything. But like, it does have a lot of great uses when you know how to apply it properly.
One of the things you just touched on was dynamic stability, the fact that you have to stabilize and obviously catch something that's moving. And this is quite interesting because I see it in this dance population, but you see it often we see it in the general population being trained on social media these days, that when people are thinking about stability or balance, we're always seeing people like on uneven surfaces or training on Bosu balls, and that's what people think of as stability training. What are your thoughts and tips on stability or balance training in general?
Yeah, so I appreciate in a rehabilitation sense, because I have worked in rehab. I work alongside a lot of athletic trainers and physios over the years. Like some of those soft, squishy surfaces do serve a purpose in terms of developing proprioception when returning from injury.
Do you mind just describing what proprioception is? Just because I know that some people listening probably don't know.
Yeah. So proprioception, a basic way to describe it is your ability to orient yourself in space, in the world, like understanding your body, you and your body understanding where you are in space. So that's why balance is so important, because it's a proprioceptive. You know where you are in space and you're able to maintain your position. Now, if you aren't able to maintain position, we need to work on that proprioception. So we need to work on your body's ability to organize itself in space and stabilize it. Be strong there. So in the context of like developing performance, like in a rehab sense, I'm all for it. And years from now, we might rewatch this podcast and I might cringe at some of the things I'm about to say. But, in general, in most sports, barring, like swimming, because obviously swimming is not a land-based, a ground-based sport, but pretty much every other sport is based on solid ground, barring beach volleyball as well.
Yeah, I'm in the weird sports.
Yeah, I appreciate the weird sports. Carry on. But like still, it is still somewhat ground based. So like in your particular case, like working on a squishy, uneven, unstable surface, probably pretty good in terms of like preventing injuries. But most other sports, when we're talking about developing force and power, we're doing it on a flat, stable surface, even some of the unevenness, say like an ultra marathon or running in the mountains, the surface is still hard. It might be uneven, but it's not squishy. Unless they're running through quicksand or on marshy ground, it's not really squishy. So like they need to be able to decelerate even on this uneven surface. So it has its place, but in general, what I think, and you kind of talked about it with like this online training now, like we forget the KISS principle. Like we're humans, we need to keep it simple. Keep it simple. And, we don't need to have them kneeling on a Bosu ball while you poke them with a stick to throw them off balance, when you can just ask them to hold an isometric hold, or you can have asymmetric carries to develop a lot of that strength and stability, especially in multiplanar environments, because as much as I love weightlifting, it works in one plane and on two legs, mostly two legs, so outside of the jerk. So as a strength and conditioning coach, all right, I'm developing this quality, but in sport, we work in 3 dimensions, up, down, side, side, rotation. We're working all over the place. So I don't think some of those like squishy surface type training has a place outside of being like a very small chunk, like maybe a little bit of the rehab, or, we can kind of call it dessert if they really like to feel like they're challenged based on doing single leg balances blindfolded, holding a kettlebell on one leg, at the end, great. But that should not be the main dish of our programming. It has its place, it has its purposes, but overall, we need to train, if we're talking sport specificity, because that's what we always talk about is sport specificity. Well, it's ground-based. We need to, practice like you play. You're going to be playing on a hard surface, on a stable surface. Cool. We need to get you strong in that one first, please.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think when athletes hear kind of okay, but we're still going to do the squat, the hinge, the push, the pull, we're still going to do the power things or the Olympic derivatives, it doesn't sound sexy. Like they're often looking for but I saw this person doing this on Instagram and this was crazy. And I'm like, yeah, maybe it was crazy, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily what you need.
Yeah, I get that all the time. They're like, oh, but this like super elite athlete does that. I was like, cool. What did they do when they were at your age and your developmental level?
Yeah. And we're also only ever seeing like a tiny snippet of what someone's doing on social media. And I think the other trouble is with social media, you never know if what you're seeing is just something they made for a reel or if it's actually something they do.
I used to say all the time, like nobody puts their bad days on Instagram, and they probably do now but under the guise of like, oh, I'm struggling too, but I can pull myself up. Like some of that sort of like false positivity, which I'm not a super fan of, like just own that it's hard. If you have a bad day and you drop the weight, okay, you might end up on the blooper reels, but that's unfortunate, but that is the nature of being an athlete, and that's awesome that you see these things that these elite athletes are looking to do that they're doing, and that's something to aspire to. But let's actually love for the message to be out there that like, hey, okay, they're at this level, but what were the steps that they did to get to that level? And I think that's something that's like very frequently overlooked in the social media age of strength and conditioning, to be honest, is what it took to get there.
I've worked with a lot of dancers as well, and something I noticed in both the dance world, but also just general athletic world, is often you'll see the beginners, they're practicing the foundations all the time, whether that is dance specific skills, or if we're talking athletes over here in the gym doing like the basic stuff in the gym. And then often you see they get to a certain level, kind of intermediate, where they think they're, and this is not everyone, but it's a generalization, where they kind of think they're too good for the basics. And then when they become really, really advanced, they're doing the basics again. Like they realize how important it is to keep that foundation polished, you know?
Yeah, I did a little bit of online lecturing for USA Weightlifting, and we kind of talk about that because everyone always wants that elite program. What are the elite people doing? They're doing the basics and they're doing them really, really well. And I think some of the issues, and I know like in the US, there's a massive argument about, early sport specialization, and for good reason. Because I know particularly in the US and maybe in the UK, it's been a little bit different. I haven't been here long enough to truly speak for it, but with early sport specialization in the US, when like injuries that you used to see at the pro level only started to trickle down into college and university, and then it started to trickle down into like high school age athletes. So things like ACL tears and like Tommy John surgeries for like baseball players, things that used to be reserved for the elites because they're working at such a high level, have trickled down because we specialize so early. Like if you have a 14-year-old where you have to keep a pitch count because he's so good and he's going from, club season to high school season to, travel baseball, and you haven't given him a rest or them a rest, and you haven't done any sort of strength and conditioning to counterbalance all those things that you're doing, so it's doing a disservice to all of our future athletes now, because we've allowed them to think about like, oh, I have to train like a pro now. I have to do those special things, but those pros are still doing this thing, the basics, very, very well and regularly. And I think that's a message that gets lost quite a lot in the search for something new and exciting and innovative. But if it boils back down to it, it was proven like 70 years ago that like squat, pull, press, hinge, let's do these basic movements, let's do them very, very well, and you'll start to have that nice foundation that you can later do all of these other things for.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, because of course the PhD is in biomechanics and you've had this focus on weightlifting, I'm curious from the biomechanics standpoint, one of the things that we've been discussing in general when it comes to lifting, but also with Olympic lifting in the last few years, is kind of fluid versus fixed variables for technique. So sort of like these would be the checkpoints for technique on, say, a clean that we always want to see. And then these would be the things that this might look a little different if this person's got different limb lengths or this person's got different requirements of their sport. So I just wondered if you have any insights on that to share if people are using weightlifting to support their sport.
Love that you asked that question, because like my favorite thing to remind people is that human movement exists on a spectrum, and each person's spectrum is slightly different. You and I are not built the same. I love Olympic weightlifting, but I'm built like a flamingo. I'm meant to be rowing ships in the North Sea if I look at my ancestry. I'm not meant to be lifting weights. I'm not built for it. But with those components, like you said, there are key technical positions that need to be met to ensure efficiency and to ensure safety. And there's actually a really great paper, I forget who the lead author is, I think it's Sham Chavda, in conjunction with like Dr. Anna Swisher. They actually have a brilliant technical model, and it breaks down like these are the stable components. These are the positions you need to be in at these different phases, but here are the variable components. Here's the things that's going to be different. So like in general, in a start position off of the floor, your feet are going to be on the floor. Variable might be the width, the degree of turnout. Those are the things that are going to be variable. Now, when the bar is at knee, those shins need to be vertical. Based on that vertical shin position and things like limb length and torso length, the angle of the back in relationship to the floor is going to look very different. Like super tall lifters are going to, they're going to look like a crane out over the top of that bar in order to have that vertical shin position. Long femurs also going to affect it. But if you look at a short lifter, short femur, short torso, their back ankle might be a little bit more upright just because they've got different body proportions. But at the base, that stable component, vertical shin, bar is at the knee, shoulders are over or slightly in front. They're going to hit a lot of those stable components, but based on, torso length, arm proportion, leg proportion, it's going to look a little bit different. So for anyone out there, I'd recommend, and you're wanting to utilize Olympic weightlifting, or weightlifting a little bit, I would check out that paper because it's really great, because it does talk about like, these are the signposts that you need to be at, but here's the variation at each of those signposts.
And I'm just curious, I wonder if this is one of the papers I've read. I don't know if it came out through the NSCA journal a couple years back. I'm not sure. I've read some paper that is...
I believe it's the NSCA
okay,
journal.
maybe this is the
I
same.
should know because I'm good friends with all of the people who wrote that. I'm pretty sure it's the NSCA Journal of Strength and Conditioning.
Yeah. If it's the paper I'm thinking of, I haven't read it for a couple of years or a year or so. I'm just curious if you remember, is it very readable for athletes? Because of course you and I have some training in scientific writing and interpretation, whereas sometimes these papers, if you're someone who maybe doesn't have that scientific background and you actually want to implement it, you go read it and it's like reading another language.
No, this one's very accessible. So like even for S&C coaches who don't have any sort of research background and might not have taken the traditional route of like getting all of these degrees and kind of understanding a little bit how to read research, it's super accessible because it's not a research paper. It's written more as like a position statement. Like these are the pieces. So it's written in a very people friendly way. You don't be a nerd to understand it.
Awesome. Nice. No, and I'll definitely put a link to it in the show notes as well. It's just nice to know if we're sending athletes that way that they can interpret it as well.
Yeah. And there's some infographics. I think there might even be photos in that paper, but if not, I know a few people who have done some infographics on it to show that kind of here's the stable, here's the variable, and, for each of the different kind of positions. So there's like a start position, at knee, power position. It's a really thorough but accessible breakdown.
Awesome. If you could give one piece of advice to athletes who are wanting to start either Olympic weightlifting or just strength training in general to support their sport, what would it be?
Well, I'm just going to kind of go back and talk about what we did before. Get really good at the basics. Push, pull, squat, hinge. Get really, really good at those. Make sure your movement is precise and consistent. Consistency is key, but so is that precision of movement. Get really, really good at those, and that's going to set a really great foundation and a really good tone for anything that you layer skill-wise in the weight room or in sports. It's going to set a really nice foundation for everything that you do after that. So get good at the basics and keep them in there all the time, please.
Awesome. I love it. Anything else that you would like to share?
No, it's been a pleasure kind of, hearing other people's perspectives or what questions other people might have on weightlifting. So like I always like sharing what I've learned. I'm a big believer in pay it forward in coaching. So if anybody ever wants to reach out with questions, I'm always happy to share. Like I don't gatekeep anything. I like to just pay it forward where possible.
And where can people find you if they'd like to reach out to you or if they're interested in working with you?
You can find me on Instagram at Beastis Athletics, or you can find me on Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, at Ange, A-N-G-E, Sorensen, S-O-R-E-N-S-E-N. So feel free to reach out. I love just chatting with people or, like asking questions, answering questions, programming, weightlifting, S&C, or, any sort of mentorship opportunities. I'm open for it all.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Just a reminder that you can find further podcast episodes at www.siobhan-milner.com/podcast. And this is where you can also find different ways of working with me if you head to www.siobhan-milner.com. Enjoy!